The sun over Wickenburg in 1889 didn't just shine, it judged. It was a relentless brassy glare that turned the horizon into a shimmering lake of heat and made the dust in the auction yard taste like copper and old regrets. Pat stood by the weathered cedar post of the main pen, his thumb hooked into his belt loop. At 40 he was a man built of lean muscle and leather, his face a map of the Arizona territory, creased by the dry wind, tanned by a sun that never quit, and etched with the quiet sorrow of a man who had outlived his young wife and his grandest ambitions. He didn't come to the auction to buy a miracle. He came for a pack animal, something with a sturdy back that wouldn't complain when the trail up to his high mountain ranch turned to shale and cactus.
Tell us where you're watching from. If these Western stories move you, share them. And subscribing helps us keep bringing new stories to life.
In the center of the ring, the horses were being cycled through like discarded tools. There were flashy pintos and sturdy bays, but the energy in the crowd shifted when she was let out. She was a chestnut mare, her coat the color of a sunset reflected in a muddy river. She had the fine bones of a racer, but the hollowed-out look of a ghost. She didn't fight the lead rope. She didn't toss her head at the smell of the other stallions. She stood in the swirling dust with her head lowered, her dark, intelligent eyes fixed on the dirt between her hooves. She didn't look like an animal. She looked like a prisoner who had finally stopped hoping for a pardon. Lot number 12, Silas Croker, the auctioneer, barked. His voice was like a shovel scraping across gravel. 5-year-old mare, solid feet, broke to the bit. Who'll give me $20? The silence that followed was heavy. A man named Miller, who ran 3,000 head of cattle and felt the need to own the air everyone breathed, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the mare's flank. "Save your wind, Silas," Miller called out. His voice carried a jagged edge of mockery. "That's the Miller discard. My boys tried to breed her for 3 seasons. We put her with the best studs in the territory. She's dry as a summer creek. A barren waste of hay. She knows it too. Look at her. She's got the mark of the curse on her." A few of the local ranch hands laughed. It was a cruel sound, the kind of laugh men used to hide their own fears of being useless. Pat didn't laugh. He looked at the mare. He saw the way her ears flickered. Not in fear, but in a weary, soul-deep acknowledgement of the words. She understood the verdict. She knew she was being sold as a failure. Pat felt a familiar cold ache in his own chest. He thought of his ranch, the high lonesome, where the wind whistled through the gaps in the adobe and the dinner table only had one chair. He thought of the neighbors who whispered that Pat was finished, a man whose line had ended when his Sarah was put in the ground. $10, Pat said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a sharp blade. Miller turned, a smirk twisting his thin lips. $10, Pat. You finally decided to start a graveyard for broken things. You can't work that horse hard. She's got no heart left, and you sure as hell won't get a foal out of her. You're buying a carcass that's still breathing. Pat stepped away from the post, his spurs jingling softly. He walked right up to the rail, looking Miller dead in the eye. "Maybe I just don't like the way you talk about a lady, Miller. Even one with 4 hooves." He turned his gaze back to the mare. $5, Pat corrected himself, his eyes never leaving the horse. "I'll give you $5, Silas, because she's been shamed enough for one day." Croker looked at Miller, then at the crowd. No one else moved. No one wanted a curse. "Sold to Pat for $5. Croker muttered, almost embarrassed. Pat stepped into the ring. The handler handed him the rope as if it were a snake. Pat didn't jerk it. He didn't click his tongue. He simply reached out and laid a broad, calloused hand against the mare's velvet nose. She flinched, her skin twitching, expecting a blow or a rough pull. When the blow didn't come, she stayed still, her breath coming in short, ragged puffs. "Easy, girl," Pat murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. The name's Pat. I ain't much to look at, and my cooking's worse. But I got a valley where the grass is sweet, and nobody's gonna call you names. We're gonna take it slow. For the first time, the mare lifted her head. She looked at him, really looked at him. There was no fire in her eyes yet, but the hollow look shifted into something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first tiny spark of a dying ember. The journey to the High Lonesome took 3 days. Pat didn't ride her. He walked. He led his old gelding, Barnaby, and the mare, whom he had named Grace. They camped under the giant saguaros and the sprawling Milky Way. Pat sat by the small mesquite fire, leaning his back against a saddle, while Grace stood just outside the circle of light. "You know, Grace," Pat said, his voice drifting into the cool night air, "folks around here think if a thing don't produce, it don't have a soul. They look at a man or a horse, and they only see the math of it. How much weight can he pull? How many calves can she drop? It's a hard way to live. Makes a body feel like a machine." Grace moved a step closer, her hooves crunching on the dry brush, her ears swiveled toward him. "I had a wife once," Pat continued, his eyes fixed on the embers. "Sarah, she was like you, graceful, quiet. We wanted a house full of noise, kids running through the dust, but it didn't happen. The doctor said the same things Miller said about you. Dry well, he called it. And she carried that weight until the fever took her. She died, thinking she'd let me down. I'd have given every acre of this territory just to tell her one more time that she was enough. Just her. That was all I needed." Grace walked into the light. She approached Pat and nudged his shoulder with her nose. It wasn't a push for food. It was a gesture of solidarity. Pat reached up and scratched her behind the ears. "Yeah," he whispered. "I reckon you understand." The months passed, and the Arizona winter turned into a sharp, clear spring. Grace filled out. The ribs that had once poked through her hide were covered in lean, powerful muscle. Her coat took on a sheen like a polished copper kettle. Pat didn't work her hard. He used her to check the fences and move the small herd of cattle, but mostly they just spent time together. He'd talk to her while he mended tack or cooked his beans, and she'd stand by the porch rail, watching him with an intensity that felt almost human. One afternoon, a neighbor named Elias rode up. He was a good man, but he had the practical mind of a rancher. "She's looking good, Pat," Elias said, leaning over his saddle horn. "Real good. You've done a wonder with her. But I heard Miller's still laughing about it in town. Says you're playing house with a Barren mare." Pat hammered a nail into a horseshoe, not looking up. "Miller's got a lot of cattle, Elias, but he's a poor man. He doesn't know the value of something that can't be sold." "Maybe so," Elias said gently. "But Pat, you're 40. You're a young man still. You could find a woman, start over. Don't let this ranch become a museum for things that can't grow." Pat stopped hammering. He looked out over the valley, where Grace was grazing near a patch of desert wildflowers. "Sometimes, Elias, just surviving is the victory. Grace and me, we're doing just fine." But then came the change. It started in the late spring. Grace became temperamental. She'd snap at Barnaby and pace the fence line at night. Pat thought she was sick. He checked her for colic, checked her hooves for stones. He even rode into town, despite the heat, to buy a specialized tonic. When he returned, he found Grace standing in the shade of the big cottonwood tree. She looked different. Her middle was thickening in a way that defied the amount of grain he was feeding her. Pat stood there, his heart suddenly racing. "No," he whispered. "It ain't possible," Miller said, the breeder said. He walked over to her, his hands trembling. He laid a palm against her flank. He waited, holding his breath, the world around him falling silent. And then he felt it, a small distinct thump, a kick from the inside. Pat staggered back as if he'd been punched. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred his vision. "Grace," he choked out. "You've been keeping a secret, haven't you?" The word got out. In a small territory like Arizona, a miracle is bigger news than a stagecoach robbery. Miller himself rode out, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You stole that foal," Miller bellowed, pulling up his horse so hard it reared. "I owned that mare for years. She was Barren. If she's with foal, it's by one of my studs, and that makes the foal mine." Pat stepped off his porch. He didn't have his rifle, but he didn't need it. The look on his face was enough to stop a charging bull. "You called her a curse, Miller," Pat said, his voice like the low roll of thunder before a storm. "You sold her for $5. You stood in that ring and you shamed her in front of the whole county. You said she was an empty vessel. Well, it turns out she wasn't empty. She just wasn't gonna give anything to a man like you. She was waiting for a place where she was loved for more than what she could produce. That foal is hers, and she is mine. Now you get off this mountain, before I show you exactly what a broken man can do." Miller looked at Pat, then at the mare. He saw the fire in Pat's eyes, and the strength in the horse's stance. He muttered a curse, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away. The birth came on a night when the Arizona sky was torn apart by a monsoon storm. Lightning flickered across the red rocks, and the rain turned the dust into a red slurry. He was in the barn, the lantern swinging from a hook. He was soaked to the bone, his muscles aching, but he didn't leave Grace's side for a second. It was a difficult labor. Grace was older, and her body was struggling. "Come on, girl," Pat urged, wiping the sweat from her eyes. "You showed them all. Don't quit now. You got a life inside you. You got a legacy." Grace let out a low, guttural groan. She looked at Pat, and for a moment the pain seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep, ancient trust. She gave one final heaving push, and then there it was. A wet, spindly-legged bundle of life slid into the straw. Pat moved with a focused intensity he hadn't felt in years. He cleared the foal's nose, rubbing it with a burlap sack. The little creature gave a tiny, high-pitched whinny, a sound of pure defiance against the storm outside. It was a filly, a perfect chestnut filly with a white star on her forehead, exactly like the one Sarah used to say she'd seen in her dreams. Grace turned her head, nickering softly, and began to lick her daughter. Pat sat back in the straw, his back against the wooden slats of the stall. He watched the miracle unfold in the amber light of the lantern. He wasn't just a 40-year-old rancher in a lonely house anymore. He was a father. He was a guardian. He was a man who knew that nothing is ever truly barren if it's planted in the right soil. When the sun rose the next morning, the desert was transformed. The rain had brought out the green in the sagebrush and the bright red of the cactus blooms. Pat stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He watched Grace walk out into the sunlight, the foal dancing at her side on wobbly, uncertain legs. The curse was gone. The silence of the high lonesome was finally broken by the sound of new life. Pat took a deep breath of the clean, rain-washed air and smiled. For the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the horizon, and for once the Arizona sun looked like a promise.
If you enjoy our Western stories, consider subscribing. It really helps us keep creating more for you.